The chamber was heavy with silence until Justice Samuel Alito's words cut through like a blade. His voice, cold and commanding, carried the weight of centuries of authority. "Congresswoman, your remarks are disrespecting tradition." The phrase echoed, as if the marble walls themselves were chosen to amplify the accusation. To the untrained eye, it looked like a reprimand. To those who knew the history of such words, it was something deeper, a warning cloaked in formality. A reminder of who had long been allowed to define the boundaries of respect in America. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. She sat motionless, her gaze locked on Alito with a calm so sharp it unsettled the room. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was resistance. The camera zoomed, catching every detail. The stillness of her shoulders, the steadiness of her breath, the refusal to blink under the glare of judicial power. While Alito leaned on centuries of tradition, she leaned on something older: survival, dignity, and truth. Reporters scribbled furiously. One anchor whispered into a live mic, "She's not saying a word." But this silence is louder than any rebuttal. The audience watching from home felt it too. It was the kind of moment that pulls a nation forward in their seats. Waiting for the spark. Gasps rippled as the tension deepened. For some, Alito's words were a call to order, a defense of the old guard. For others, they rang hollow, a desperate attempt to preserve a tradition that had too often been used to silence voices like Crockett's. This was no longer about a single exchange. It was about whether authority could still shame truth into silence. The chamber held its breath. Crockett's eyes never wavered. Her silence became its own form of defiance, a mirror held up to Alito's authority, forcing the weight of his words back onto him. And then, just as the moment threatened to collapse under its own gravity, the question hung in the air, not what he had said, but how she would answer. But no one was ready for the way Crockett's reply would flip centuries of power on its head. Asterisk. Justice Samuel Alito had built his career and his reputation as the stalwart guardian of conservative values. For decades, he had been framed as the custodian of tradition, the voice reminding America that its laws, its customs, its very institutions should be tethered to the past. Too many, his words carried an almost unshakable authority, the kind that could silence dissent with a single gavel strike. He wasn't just another justice. He was the embodiment of a certain America, one that clung tightly to rigid rules, and reverence for power as it had always been. And that was precisely why his accusation struck so hard. When Alito leaned forward, charging Jasmine Crockett with disrespecting tradition, it was more than a personal reprimand. It was a warning shot, aimed not just at her, but at every voice daring to challenge the sanctity of the old order. His words weren't designed for debate. They were designed to remind her of her place, but Crockett wasn't here to be reminded. She was here to redefine. Her rise had already unsettled the balance. A Texas attorney who fought for the voiceless, congresswoman who had refused to bend in the face of hostile hearings. She represented something new, something Alito's world wasn't built to contain. Crockett embodied a leadership style that wasn't loud for its own sake, but steady, unshaken, rooted in truth. And in that steadiness lay a challenge to the very foundations of Alito's authority, because this wasn't just courtroom. This was about whose values would shape America's future. Would the nation continue to bow to a version of tradition that too often served as a weapon to exclude, to silence, to diminish? Or would it embrace a new definition, one where dignity, inclusivity, and progress weren't exceptions, but expectations? The stakes stretched beyond that chamber. Millions watching from their living rooms weren't simply witnessing a clash of personalities. They were seeing a crossroads for the country itself. On one side, the guardians of rigid tradition, wielding authority like a shield against change. On the other, disruptors like Crockett, demanding that democracy live up to its promises, not its excuses. And as the silence lingered after Alito's charge, America held its breath. The cameras caught the smallest tremors, a raised eyebrow in the gallery, a smirk from those who thought Crockett would fold, the nervous scribbling of notes by journalists who sensed history might be unfolding before them. This wasn't a spat. It was a reckoning. Every heartbeat in that chamber carried the weight of history grinding against the future. The tension wasn't simply about what Crockett would say next. It was about whether one woman's composure could puncture centuries of inherited authority, whether her defiance could plant a flag in the shifting ground of America's values, and deep down, everyone watching knew this wasn't just a sharp exchange. It was the sound of history grinding against the future. Samuel Alito did not stumble into power. He carved his path with the precision of a man who believed he was destined to guard the gates of America's tradition. From the manicured lawns of Princeton to the vaulted lecture halls of Yale, his trajectory was not simply academic, it was ideological. These institutions, drenched in legacy, became the crucible where his worldview hardened. He was not content to learn the law. He came to embody the kind of jurist who saw himself less as a servant of the people and more as a custodian of a sacred order. By the time he ascended to the Supreme Court, Alito had already crafted a reputation as the sharp-tongued architect of conservatism. His dissents were rarely bland or restrained. They were weapons pointed at the beating heart of social progress. When the tide of history leaned toward equality, he wrote with a voice that snapped back toward restraint. When movements surged forward, he held his ground with the authority of someone who believed tradition itself gave him license to say no. His defenders called him principled, disciplined, a jurist who refused to bend to the winds of the day. But his critics saw something else entirely, a rigidity so unyielding it became arrogance. To them, his intellect was not a gift of clarity, but a tool of control, wrapped in the language of principle, but deployed to maintain the very hierarchies progress sought to dismantle. Alito thrived on this paradox, cloaking resistance to change in the robes of respectability. When pressed on issues of rights, dignity, or inclusion, he invoked the sanctity of tradition like a talisman. For him, tradition was not just history. It was armor. Yet, as countless communities knew too well, tradition had also been the very justification for their exclusion. The good old days Alito so often defended were not good for everyone. The controversies piled up. His dismissals of critics carried a tone not just of disagreement but of disdain, as if their challenges were beneath the dignity of response. In public speeches, his fiery defenses of the status quo were less measured commentary than warning shots. Do not tamper with what has been built. Do not push too far. Do not forget who decides where the boundaries lie. He wielded his authority like a gavel, firm, heavy, absolute. And in Washington's halls of power, that gavel echoed louder than most voices could shout. But beneath the veneer of judicial dignity was a man deeply aware of the shifting tides outside the marble walls. Social movements, new leaders, changing demographics, all were forces that tugged at the foundations he had pledged to defend. Too many, he was the embodiment of the villain archetype, intellect sharpened into weaponry. Authority bolstered by robes, rigidity transformed into arrogance, all cloaked under the noble banner of principle. He did not rage wildly like a politician desperate for sound bites. His power was subtler, colder, more dangerous, the calm assurance that the law, tradition, and precedent were forever on his side. But every villain carries within them the seeds of their unraveling. Alito's greatest strength, his unwavering confidence in tradition, was also his blind spot. Because history does not stand still. Generations change. Voices long silenced rise again. And when confronted with those voices, with their lived truths and unflinching steadiness, even the loudest guardians of tradition can find their authority exposed as brittle. That is what made the moment with Jasmine Crockett so electric. For years, Alito had been the one defining the terms of respect, the arbiter of what counted as dignity, the judge who could reduce centuries of struggle to a footnote in defense of the past. Yet here was Crockett, unshaken, unmoved, staring back at him, not as an inferior, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. Her silence did not cower before his charge. It sharpened it. And that was the danger for men like Alito. They were not accustomed to silence that resisted rather than submitted, to composure that unsettled rather than obeyed. For decades, his gavel had been the final word. But in this chamber, at this moment, America was about to see something he had never accounted for, because even the strongest gavel can splinter when silence sharpens into resistance. Jasmine. Crockett's story does not begin in the marble chambers of Washington. It begins in Texas, where the weight of history pressed heavy, and where justice was not an abstract principle, but a daily fight for survival. Before she was a congresswoman, before the cameras tracked her every move, she was an attorney who chose to represent the people most often overlooked, the poor, the marginalized, the ones whose voices rarely echoed in courtrooms built to serve the powerful. In those courtrooms, Crockett learned early that bias is not always shouted. Sometimes it is whispered in dismissive tones, hidden in rulings, or wrapped in the polite armor of procedure. She faced judges who treated her clients like nuisances, prosecutors who assumed guilt before evidence was presented, and systems designed to wear people down until silence felt easier than resistance. But silence was never an option for her. She understood that every case was more than paperwork. It was someone's life, someone's dignity, someone's proof that the system could be bent toward fairness if someone had the courage to fight. Her reputation grew not because she raised her voice, but because she mastered control. While others shouted, she listened. While others dismissed, she dissected. Precision became her shield, calm her greatest weapon. In spaces where she was expected to break under hostility, she stood straighter, knowing that her composure unsettled those who thrived on chaos. Her very presence, a black woman attorney demanding equal ground, was itself a quiet revolution. When she entered Congress, she carried that revolution with her. The halls of power were no less hostile, only louder, more theatrical and televised for the nation to see. The interruptions came faster, the condescension sharper, the dismissals more public. Yet Crockett brought with her the same weaponry that had carried her through Texas courtrooms, dignity sharpened by survival. Each insult she absorbed became fuel, each attempt to undermine her a reminder of why she was there. For her constituents, she was more than a representative. She was a reflection. She embodied the struggle of communities long written out of tradition, communities told to wait, to be patient, to respect customs that had never respected them. Crockett refused that script. Where tradition had been used to exclude, she used her platform to include. Where rules had been bent to suppress, she bent them back toward justice. Her calm was not weakness. It was generational strength, inherited from those who endured far worse, yet refused to disappear. Every pause she held in a hearing carried the weight of ancestors who had been silenced. Every careful word a reminder that she spoke not just for herself, but for millions who rarely got the microphone. She did not need to match the volume of those who attacked her. Her power was in the stillness that forced the nation to listen. And so, when Samuel Alito leaned forward with his charge of disrespecting tradition, Crockett knew exactly what that meant. She knew that tradition had too often been weaponized against people like her, turned into a chain rather than a foundation. She knew that what he called disrespect, she called survival, and what he labeled tradition, she recognized as exclusion dressed in ceremony. Her entire journey had prepared her for this moment. The years in Texas courtrooms where she stared down dismissive judges, the nights when she pored over cases knowing her client's life hung on her precision, the congressional hearings where senior colleagues tried to drown her out with bluster. Each of these was a rehearsal for the confrontation unfolding now. Because Crockett was never just a politician. She was the sum of a lineage that had endured and adapted, a living contradiction to the narrative that tradition belonged only to the powerful. Her presence in Congress was not an accident of politics, but a deliberate correction of history, proof that voices long excluded could not only enter the chamber, but reshape its tone. The emotional truth of her story was undeniable. She did not fight for recognition. She fought to ensure no one else would be erased. To her supporters, every moment she stood her ground was personal validation. To her critics, her calm refusal to yield was an infuriating reminder that their authority no longer went uncontested. And that was the difference between Alito and Crockett. He drew strength from the permanence of tradition. She drew strength from the permanence of resilience. He clung to the idea that power must remain fixed. She embodied the reality that power shifts when dignity refuses to bow. Now, the stage was set. On one side, a justice cloaked in the authority of history, convinced tradition would shield him from challenge. On the other, a congresswoman whose every step was defiance of the barriers tradition once imposed. The chamber was silent, the nation watching, air thick with the clash of two Americas, one holding fast to the past, the other demanding a future. And now, that resilience was about to collide with Alito's lecture on tradition. Samuel Alito's voice cut through the chamber like a gavel striking wood, heavy with authority and sharpened by indignation. He leaned forward again, unwilling to let the moment pass without doubling down. "This isn't just about your words," he declared, his tone seething with accusation. "It's about your arrogance. It's about respect. If you want to be taken seriously in this institution, you must first learn to respect its traditions." The word respect echoed across the room, as though it were meant to flatten every dissent, every challenge, every deviation from the scripted deference he demanded. To many, it sounded less like an appeal to decorum and more like a command for submission. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't rush to fill the space he carved out with his condemnation. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Long, deliberate, unbending. Silence that made Alito's words hang uncomfortably in the air. Exposed for what they were, not wisdom, not reason, but a grasping attempt to assert dominance through tone alone. The silence became its own kind of reply, and it unsettled him. Because Alito was used to sparring with opponents who would immediately defend themselves, who would scramble to prove they weren't arrogant, who would fold their strength into appeasement. But Crockett's refusal to rush into his frame left him twisting in the discomfort of his own demand. Around the chamber, the tension thickened. Some nodded their heads firmly with Alito, finding reassurance in his invocation of tradition, eager to believe that the old order was still firmly intact. Others, however, could not look away from Crockett's composure. They saw in her silence not arrogance, but a refusal to cower, and it struck them with awe. It was the kind of silence that unsettles the powerful because it refuses to grant them validation. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed tighter and whispers rippled through the rows of staffers who felt, instinctively, that something irreversible was building. The energy was no longer just an exchange of words. It was a powder keg of values, ready to ignite. Crockett's silence was not absence. It was presence, charged and deliberate. It magnified every breath in the room, every heartbeat waiting for her response. It told the nation, "You cannot shame me into silence, and you cannot bully me into deference." Alito, perhaps sensing the growing imbalance, leaned back with the certainty of a man convinced he had reasserted control. His lips curled faintly in satisfaction, as though her stillness was proof that his lecture had landed. To him, her composure read as concession. He believed he had silenced her, but to the millions watching beyond the chamber walls, it was clear something else was unfolding. Crockett was not silenced. She was waiting, measuring, preparing, and the weight of her impending words loomed, heavier with each second of quiet. The divide in the chamber sharpened, tradition on one side, dignity on the other. Gasps had given way to an electric hush, the kind that made everyone lean forward in their seats, the kind that made even whispers sound deafening. And then, as Alito reclined with certainty in his authority, as though his words had closed the matter, Jasmine Crockett finally opened her mouth. Jasmine Crockett's voice broke the silence not with volume, but with weight, slow, deliberate, unwavering, the kind of voice that didn't compete with shouting, because it didn't need to. It owned the air by refusing to rush. "Justice Alito," she began, steady and unshaken, "you speak of tradition as though it is synonymous with respect. But tradition has never been a shield for justice. Too often, it has been a mask for injustice." Her words hung in the chamber like thunderclouds, heavy and gathering force. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift. She wasn't merely responding to his accusation, she was reframing the entire battlefield. She drew on history, each sentence deliberate, carving her case with precision. Tradition, justice, once said that people like me were not equal enough to vote. Tradition once told women they were too fragile to serve in public office. Tradition defended segregation. Tradition excused cruelty. Tradition locked the door to power and threw away the key. Tell me, was that respect? Alito's jaw tightened. He raised his chin slightly, as though preparing to cut her off, but Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was more commanding than any gavel. She continued, never breaking her rhythm. Tradition never freed us. Truth did. Tradition never gave us dignity. Struggle did. Tradition never opened these doors to people who look like me, who fight like me, who speak with the courage to challenge the old order. And yet, here I stand. The chamber was silent except for the scratch of pens and the click of cameras capturing every flicker of her face. Crockett's composure was magnetic. She wasn't speaking just to Alito. She was speaking to history, to the millions watching, to the generations who had lived under the shadow of the word tradition used as a weapon. Alito shifted in his chair, clearing his throat, attempting to regain footing. Congresswoman, with all due respect. But his interjection was swallowed by the silence of respect that now surrounded Crockett. No one leaned toward him. No one echoed his attempt. The chamber wasn't listening to the justice of the Supreme Court. It was listening to her, and she pressed on, with scalpel-like calm. Respect is not demanded by titles, Justice Alito. It is earned by actions. If this institution deserves respect, it is because it listens to every voice. It's not because it silences the ones that make it uncomfortable. You confuse tradition with power, but power without truth is just noise. Gasps rippled across the room. Some shifted in their seats, as though a forbidden line had just been crossed. Others sat straighter, electrified by the clarity in her words. Alito tried again, his voice sharper, more brittle now. Congresswoman, you, but Crockett's tone cut smoothly across his, not by shouting, but by refusing to yield. Her calm was the louder voice. Respect, justice, she said, her gaze never wavering, is not about bowing your head to what came before. It's about standing tall for what must come next. If you want to speak of arrogance, let's name it clearly. Arrogance is asking people who have been excluded to worship the very rules that kept them out. Arrogance is demanding silence from those whose existence unsettles your comfort. I will not participate in that. Her words didn't just rebut his attack, they inverted it. What Alito had tried to wield as a weapon now stood revealed as evidence of the very injustice Crockett was exposing. Every syllable landed like a hammer on stone, breaking the old facade of authority. She wasn't yelling, wasn't gesturing wildly, wasn't playing to theatrics, and yet the chamber trembled with the force of her restraint. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her tone softening, but her words cutting sharper than ever. Tradition, justice, is a story, but so is progress. And one day, when they tell this story, when they tell our story, it will not be about how loudly someone shouted. It will be about who had the courage to speak truth quietly and refuse to bow. The words poured like a verdict, calm and final. Alito's composure, once ironclad, was cracking. His face betrayed flashes of frustration, his lips tightening as if searching for a retort that refused to come. He was, for once, silent, not because he chose to be, but because the room no longer gave him the floor. Crockett finished with a line that landed like the strike of a bell. You can guard tradition all you like, Justice, but tradition doesn't define America's future. Truth does. Dignity does. And dignity will outlast every gavel. The silence that followed was absolute, not awkward, not empty, reverent, the kind of silence that falls when something irreversible has just been said, when everyone in the room knows they've witnessed a moment that will not fade. Even Alito, who had begun the exchange with such certainty, sat back in his chair, exposed by the calm he had mistaken for weakness. But the moment wasn't finished, because while the chamber fell still, the world beyond it was already stirring. Reporters raced to file stories, cameras flickered as footage uploaded, and millions at home reached for their phones to replay the scene again and again. And yet, as powerful as it was inside those four walls, the true eruption was only beginning. Because the real explosion wasn't in that chamber, it was online. And it was unstoppable. The chamber fell into silence, but the internet did not. Within minutes, the exchange between Justice Alito and Jasmine Crockett was clipped, uploaded, and detonating across every corner of social media. Twitter, or what millions still stubbornly called Twitter, lit up first. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett.com, hashtag Truth Over Tradition, hashtag Alito Tradition. Each tag carried its own wave of commentary, from reverent applause to blistering takedowns of the justice's words. One tweet read, "Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice once and still demolished centuries of arrogance. This is what power looks like." Another, more biting, paired Alito's frozen expression with the caption, "When tradition meets reality." That image alone racked up 500,000 retweets in hours. On TikTok, the moment transformed into remix culture gold. Creators spliced Crockett's calm line, "Tradition never freed us. Truth did," with cinematic soundtracks. Some overlaid her words on historic footage of civil rights marches. Others turned it into inspirational edits set to swelling orchestral music. Teenagers stitched the clip with their own voices, whispering, "Say it louder," though Crockett's brilliance had been that she didn't need to. The hashtag #Crockett mic drop surged past 20 million views before the evening was over. Memes painted Alito as a caricature, dubbed Mr. Tradition, clutching dusty law books while Crockett stood side by side with symbols of progress, diverse crowds, protest signs, flags of inclusion. One viral post showed an image of Alito trapped inside a snow globe labeled Tradition while Crockett tapped the glass with a finger, smirking, "Shall I?" Late-night comedy wasted no time. By the next evening, every major host had spliced the confrontation into their opening monologues. One quipped, "Justice Alito wanted respect for tradition. He got schooled by a new tradition, dignity that doesn't flinch." The audience roared. Another called it the courtroom roast of the century, and she never even raised her voice. The clip played to laughter, applause, and chants of Crockett's name echoing across television studios. But beyond comedy, analysts on news networks gave the moment a deeper weight. On MSNBC, one commentator leaned forward, visibly moved. This wasn't just a clapback. This was a generational anthem. Crockett represented every American who's ever been told to respect tradition when what they were really being told was to stay silent. CNN panels debated the long-term impact. One anchor framed it starkly. "Tonight we saw the collapse of tradition as a shield for authority. Crockett forced us to confront whether tradition in America should be revered or interrogated. Even conservative-leaning outlets, while critical of her tone, couldn't ignore the power of the exchange. They replayed it endlessly, their headlines half condemnation, half admission. Crockett strikes back against Supreme Court justice." By morning, Crockett's words had already been printed on T-shirts, turned into protest posters, and framed as motivational mantras on Instagram Reels. Activists began using the phrase "truth over tradition" as a rallying cry. Young voters, in particular, latched onto the moment as proof that dignity could disrupt even the highest echelons of power. For many, it wasn't just political, it was personal. Social media feeds overflowed with comments from teachers, immigrants, first-generation professionals, everyday Americans. One post read, "My grandmother was told tradition meant she couldn't work. Tonight, Crockett told me dignity means I can do anything. I'm crying watching this." Another, "Alito reminded me of every boss who told me to know my place. Crockett reminded me why I never listened." The resonance reached beyond America's borders. International outlets picked it up, framing it as a moment of global symbolism. In Europe, commentators compared Crockett's calm, dismantling of Alito to historical speeches against colonial power. In South America, activists praised it as a new language of resistance. In Africa, social media users shared clips with captions like, "This is how you fight arrogance, with silence sharper than noise." And yet, beneath the humor, the memes, the applause, something heavier stirred. People weren't just laughing at Alito or cheering for Crockett. They were questioning what it meant when tradition itself was wielded like a weapon. Dinner tables, classrooms, and community meetings buzzed with the same questions. Whose tradition? At what cost? Who gets to decide? Because while Crockett's mic drop dismantled one justice, in one chamber, the aftershocks were shaking something far larger. And as the laughter began to fade into reflection, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Yet beneath the humor and applause, a deeper reckoning began to take shape. When the noise of memes and headlines settled, what remained was not just the memory of an exchange, but the echo of something deeper, something that refused to fade. Jasmine Crockett herself framed it best when she finally spoke publicly about the viral clash. Her voice carried no hint of triumphalism, only conviction. This was never about me versus him. It was about progress versus stagnation. Her words cut through the fog of spectacle and placed the moment in its true arena. Because Alito's attack, sharp and cloaked in authority, is never only about one congresswoman's posture toward tradition. It was about who gets to define the boundaries of belonging in this country. Crockett made that crystal clear, not with fire, but with a steady light that refused to dim. She didn't dismiss tradition outright. Instead, she redefined it. Tradition without justice is noise. Dignity endures. That line became the anthem of her reflection, printed on posters, sung in chants at rallies, whispered in classrooms where teachers pressed pause on the viral clip so students could absorb its meaning. For Crockett, tradition wasn't an untouchable relic. It was a test, a measure of whether the past could serve the living, or whether it chained them to silence. In that reframing, Crockett elevated the entire confrontation into something larger than a battle of personalities. She turned it into a parable of democracy. A democracy that doesn't survive by obeying the loudest voice or bowing to the most senior gavel, but by choosing dignity when intimidation tries to take its place. Analysts who had once marveled at the theatrics now began to reckon with the depth. One columnist wrote, "Crockett didn't just resist an insult. She modeled the resistance that democracy itself requires: patience, precision, and unshakable dignity." The contrast was impossible to ignore. Alito's rigidity, his clinging to tradition as an untouchable idol, left him looking brittle. Crockett's resilience, forged in years of fighting systemic bias, sharpened by the lived weight of survival, left her looking unbreakable. One figure demanded deference, the other commanded respect. And therein lay the lesson. Progress isn't about volume. It isn't about insisting louder that the past is sacred. Progress, as Crockett showed, is about holding still when the storm howls. About speaking only when the silence is ready to carry your words across generations. For millions watching, her calm dismantling of a justice's scorn became symbolic of something far greater. That democracy, fragile though it may be, carries within it the tools to resist arrogance. Dignity is not weakness. Restraint is not surrender. And truth, once spoken, cannot be shoved back into silence, no matter how stern the voice that tries. It was no longer Alito versus Crockett. It was the oldest American battle playing out in real time. Exclusion versus inclusion. Fear versus hope. Tradition as a chain versus tradition as a foundation for something stronger. Crockett's calm that day gave permission to millions of Americans to believe that endurance itself could be revolutionary. That not every fight had to be won with a scream. That sometimes survival, composure, and a well-placed truth are enough to flip the weight of centuries. And yet, even as the dust settled, even as Crockett's line began to etch itself into the lexicon of modern politics, one question refused to leave the air. It hummed through classrooms, echoed in sermons, lingered in dinner table debates. It was a question not just for politicians, but for every citizen who saw themselves in the reflection of that viral clip. And for millions, one piercing question echoed: who defines America's future voice? The chamber may have returned to its routine, but the echo of that clash refuses to fade. Alito accused. Crockett endured, and America bore witness to a shift not measured in policy or precedent, but in the pulse of a nation learning once again what dignity looks like under fire. If you felt that spark when Crockett's calm rose above the noise, you weren't alone. Millions across the country felt it too, in living rooms, classrooms, and crowded feeds glowing with her words. It wasn't just pride in a single woman's strength. It was recognition that her fight was also ours, that her stillness carried our struggles, our resilience, our refusal to be silenced. That is why this channel exists, to remind us that when arrogance shouts, dignity answers. And that answer reverberates longer, stronger, deeper than any gavel strike or lecture about tradition. So here's the invitation. If you believe in amplifying the voices that refuse to bow, subscribe. If you want these moments of courage to reach farther, share. If you know that democracy is only as strong as the communities that defend it, join us. Because here, we don't just watch history unfold. We carry it forward. This wasn't just a clash in Congress. It wasn't just another headline, another trending clip. It was a reminder that America's true voice isn't found in the loudest demand for obedience, but in the quiet, unshaken strength of those who speak for justice. And that voice, your voice, our voice, is only getting louder. Because this wasn't just a clash. It was a reminder of what America's voice truly sounds like.